Hello everyone, welcome back to the series where we discuss motions from recently held tournaments, and I'm Dinako Vikram Singh, and I'm a past debater of Ananda College, Colombo, and currently the head coach of Sri College. And I'll be discussing the motion that this House believes that Operation Yukthiya has done more harm than good. I'll be first talking about the prop case and then moving on to the op case, and then discussing the sort of substantial matter and the characterizations that could have come up from either side, and if possible, the clashes and what clashes of an ideal debate would look like. Okay, so when you're talking about prop, your burden of proof in this debate is to necessarily prove that Operation Yukti has massive amounts of harms that can't necessarily be neglected and can't necessarily be turned a blind eye to, and also the dangers of this sort of policing and sort of issues that can come about from it, and like why exactly it's necessarily a bad idea to solve the drug issue here in the first place. So an issue I saw in this debate when it happened at NMPs was that I felt like the proposition side sort of failed to understand as to how exactly Yukthiya works and under what sort of parameters does it actually operate. So I'll be doing a bit of characterization as to how Yukthiya works and how it operates in general. So it's mainly a government-done process. So it's done by the Sri Lankan government with the support of the police and tri-forces. It comes under the Ministry of Public Security, I believe, and it's done nationwide. Like you stop random buses and like check everyone's bags, and you check people's belongings in random public places and so on and so forth. So it necessarily operates under the Sri Lankan government and the Ministry of Public Security, and so I feel like the ideal way for prop to tackle this, the principles of this debate, is more along to prove to me as to what exactly are the principal harms that can come about from the government doing this sort of extreme policing on the public, and why exactly it's a bad thing and the sort of repercussions that can come about from it. All right, so it's important when you're not defending Yukthiya, you need to like prove to me as to what exactly the sort of countermeasures that can be taken, because there are two ways that you can handle this debate. Firstly is that you can talk about how the drug use in Sri Lanka is not such big of a problem, and like Yukthiya is not necessarily needed because it's not that much of a problem in Sri Lanka, which is a kind of a tough burden to take upon yourself, because drug issues have been sort of a big issue in Sri Lanka. You've seen it with usage among school children, among like illegal substances among youngsters in nightclubs and parties and all that sort of thing. So it's kind of hard to prove that there is no harm whatsoever, because the harm does exist and drug use is sort of an issue. So then the next course of action is to show that you need to show that there are better alternatives to Yukthiya, and like how exactly you can solve this issue on a much more less of an extreme way, and like more of a lenient way of solving this issue, and like more moderate way of solving this issue. So the ideal scenario would be like you have independent commissions that are appointed by the government itself, and that act independently from the government, so you will have no government intervention whatsoever. So examples of these sort of things that do work in Sri Lanka is like the Public Utilities Commission of Sri Lanka and the COPE Committee of Sri Lanka, which again are appointed by the government to keep state institutions in check and balance. And these institutions are independent as they come, because during the economic crisis in Sri Lanka, we had the Public Utilities Commission of Sri Lanka standing up against the government and blocking certain reforms when it came to electricity bills and electricity cuts and all that. So they operate as an independent body. Same with the COPE committee, where you have them prosecuting certain high-ranking government officials for certain financial mishaps that happen within the state system. So these sort of institutions can exist, and I feel like prop can benefit largely by saying that instead of like going extreme full on with Yukthiya, you can have this sort of moderate commissions that follows a proper due process and doesn't have as extreme policing within the system, and how exactly it's much better to have why it's exactly much better to have this sort of thing as opposed to extreme policing done under the government by the government, and the sort of dangers that can come about from it. All right. So then it's necessary for you to prove as to why exactly being devoid of government intervention and government influence is exactly important, and this should be trickling down to your argumentation and proving to me as to why exactly the government shouldn't have this much of power to come out there and police people the way they want and just search people randomly on the street and whatnot, right? Okay, so you can talk about independent commissions, like you have much more transparency. There will be more of a due process, and like the actions would be much more moderate, and it can be it can be subjected to scrutiny much more easily than the government than governments can be. So you can hold them accountable, and which means that they're more likely to operate under the framework of the law, as opposed to necessarily just going full on and just exercising their monopoly of violence to the maximum extent that you can. And I'll be explaining this further in the arguments. All right. So here, an important concession that I feel like the government should make, and which wasn't made in the debate that happened, was that I feel like the government needs to make the concession that drug problems is an issue and it needs to be solved. But it's the manner that Yukthiya is operating, it actually doesn't provide an effective solution, and why there are much more, and how it exactly blocks the way for much more moderate solutions to come into play, and why exactly having those sort of moderate solutions is much more of an important thing. Okay, so I'll be moving to the first argument about the principal harm that exists, which wasn't talked as much enough in the debate that happened. All right. So let's talk about the polarization of these issues, and the politicization of these issues, and how exactly it works in current status quo. Because as of status quo, you have like Yukthiya, you have this many stats like coming out on a weekly or monthly or daily basis on the media saying that you arrested this many people, you've taken this much amount of drugs into custody, this many people areas were searched, and this many people were detained, were put into courts. But you get all these statistics on a daily basis, and it's like being publicized on the media all over the country, right? So here the issue is that when it's operating under the government and the Ministry of Public Security, is that there's an inherent chance of this being politicized. Not a chance; it's already being politicized in status quo for their own benefit, because you have elections coming up in Sri Lanka. And not either side of the political spectrum is being favored as much. So you have government officials, you have politicians going out there and trying to use Yukthiya as a way of showing the stats, trying to create this image that people that they are doing something, that they're actually creating change, like pandering to people's needs, and just showing all these statistics and using it for making this an extremely politicized issue, which is extremely harmful, right? And this is necessarily dangerous, because you can have this sort of thing being making unlawful arrests to just increase the number of statistics, because you can just because a person has like something that can be like mildly illegal, you can make a big deal out of it, just arrest people just to increase the numbers, put people into courts just to increase the numbers, just to show the people that you're trying to do this sort of thing, right? Which necessarily strays away from the initial purpose of this operation, which was to curb the drug problem too much as you can. But now it's turned into this more of a political fiesta, where you boast about how many people you arrested, which can lead to much more bigger structural issues within the country itself, right? Like unwanted policing and unwarranted arrests, and innocent people being put behind bars just to increase the statistics, because these are the sort of things that can exist in countries like Sri Lanka, where corruption is sort of rampant, right? And then you can, on second level, talk about the sort of dangers that exist with this sort of policing, because if you take the context of Sri Lanka, and like you need to sort of characterize as to what exactly Sri Lanka looks like, and the sort of situation that you have in Sri Lanka, and the perceptions among the general public when it comes to their human rights and rights in general, right? Because in countries like Sri Lanka, things like human rights, things like rights aren't necessarily, it's not very vocally spoken about. It's not like people are very educated about these things. People don't necessarily understand that there are massive amounts of dangers of people of this amount of policing, and the sort of effects that it can have to their liberties and whatnot, right? So with things like Yukthiya, and when things like Yukthiya are like glorified by state media and media in general, and like boasted by politicians, then it's when they try to get the support of the general public to make sure that they consent to this sort of policing, to this level of policing, which can necessarily lead to governments necessarily having an extreme amount of influence on your daily life, to like governments being like, it can trickle down to situations where governments are allowed to strip search you whenever they want, just barge into your private spaces and like search you what whenever you want without warrants and whatnot. So this is an actual that issue that can happen in status quo, right? Because people just see Yukthiya as this glorified great thing, and it's like being like portrayed as this like really brilliant thing. And especially in a country where people, like I said, aren't that educated about human rights and their rights, it makes their rights necessarily more vulnerable than they are right now. And the dangers that can exist from this is that on a principle level, you can talk about how people in general are in danger of being influenced by the government and being subjected to extreme amounts of policing, and that is something that people aren't necessarily aware about, right? Because of this sort of manipulation that does exist within state state mandated media and all forms of media as well, right? And then you can talk about like the issues that exist, the structural issues that exist within the Sri Lankan government as well, because you may arrest 35,000, you may arrest like so many people, thousands of people, just based on illegal possession of something something like weed. But then at the same time, you will have the people on the higher up of this drug business like being scot-free just simply because of the rampant corruption that exists in the Sri Lankan government system and the police system as a whole, right? Because this is an actual issue that exists in Sri Lanka. Because you can arrest like low-level people, like people who are possessing these drugs, transporting these drugs, or people who are just selling the drugs because they don't have any means of making a proper life for themselves, because the system sort of failed them. But at the same time, even when you arrest these people, you still don't make any progressive impact, because the people who are actually the root cause of the issue are still out there, and they are free just simply because they have connections. Because this can things like drug issues, like they go higher up to higher up places in the government, where you have like higher officials in the government being parts of this like drug circles, people in the police being in parts of this drug circle. And like since this entire operation is so politicized, it's very less likely that these people will be prosecuted for what they do. So at the end of the day, no matter how many people you arrest, you're not going to be making any probable change, because the change that you're looking for won't happen until you get the entire all the people who are sort of responsible for these sort of crimes. And see, due to the existing corruption and due to the existing corruption within the Sri Lankan government and the Sri Lankan police, this sort of thing is less likely to happen. And the government can just simply use the stat padding, like just show that okay, we did this much, we arrested this many people, and just to make themselves look good, which means that you're not necessarily making any probable changes. Which leads you to the second argument about effectivity on solving the problem as a whole, right? So here's where you talk about your counter model a bit, right? So you talk about your counter model and like talk about independent commissions and how they would work. I think it's up to Prop to sort of describe as to how exactly these independent models, independent government bodies are supposed to work, right? So ideally, like I said in the beginning of this video, it's best that you sort of characterize it in the way that the Public Utilities Commission of Sri Lanka or the COPE Committee of Sri Lanka sort of operates, right? Because then you can sort of prove as to why the issues that exist with Yukthiya won't exist on your paradigm, by proving to me as to why exactly government intervention is the biggest issue here. And the moment you're devoid of government intervention, you have the ability to make like much better choices, like much better choices independently, and like actually arrest the people in charge, right? Because this can be seen in Sri Lanka currently, where you hold higher up government officials under these accountable at least to a certain degree. Sure, at the end of the day, they might get off scot-free when they get put into court, and they might be remanded for a week, and that's about it. But still, that's still much more better than what's happening in Yukthiya, where they are not being held accountable for any reason whatsoever, right? So you need to prove to me why exactly these counter models won't have the issues that exist with Yukthiya, right? And also, you can talk about how this is a much more rational approach, and how the existence of Yukthiya as a whole sort of blocks the way for much more rational approaches, for moderate approaches to sort of see the light of day, simply because Yukthiya is like just supposedly the best way to do things, right? So you can talk about how this is a much more rational approach, and it would be much more effective since you actually can hold people accountable under these independent commissions, right? Also, you can talk about why exactly it's more feasible, because you can talk about how the goals that these independent commissions set for themselves are much more realistic, and how they don't necessarily have an agenda, any political agenda, and how exactly these are very transparent, can be held accountable, and can be held accountable for what they do, and all that sort of thing. So the second argument necessarily needs to be focused on your paradigm, where you propose a much better way. Well, since it's necessary now, it's a debate about whether it's done more harm than good. I feel like the second argument should be focused on the existence of Yukthiya and how exactly it blocks the way for much more better things from happening in status quo, things like independent commissions, like you said, and why exactly that's a much more better thing to have as opposed to Yukthiya. All right, let's move on to the op case, right? So op's main thing when they're setting up this debate is supposed to be about how drug usage issues in Sri Lanka are so bad and how it's so rampant. You can talk about how drugs are easily accessible for school kids, for young people at nightclubs and parties and all this sort of things, right? And you need to sort of prove to me as to why exactly Yukthiya is the only way to go about this thing, and how exactly it does a massive amount of good to society and good in general that you just simply can't neglect. Why exactly neglect the good that has been done. All right, so captain Sri Lanka as to how Sri Lanka works, and you can the easiest response to the sort of independent commission's argument is just talk about things like warranted arrests aren't necessarily going to work in Sri Lanka, because like I said before, corruption is still a pretty big issue in Sri Lanka. So things like warranted arrest, even though independent commissions can act independently, they still need to go through government agencies like the police, like the CID, to make sure that they make these arrests. And those sort of arrests are less likely to happen because of the rampant corruption that exists in status quo as well, right? Then you can also talk about how exactly you can talk about the United Nations sort of condemning this sort of thing, and how exactly the United Nations don't necessarily know the situation that exists within these countries, and how it's been the case in so many sort of instances, because UN is pretty much useless. But yeah, so moving on to the arguments here. Firstly, you can talk about the effectivity of curbing the drug issue as a whole, right? Because you can talk about it might be just head-patting. Sure, the government just might be arresting people just to make it look good. But at the same time, the easiest response to that is if so many unlawful arrests are happening and so many innocent people are being put behind bars, even in a country like Sri Lanka, where corruption in governments is such a big issue, you still have an active media that still talks against the government, right? Because you have independent media organizations, you have people on social media talking about issues in the government, like Sri Lanka, the corruption is bad, but still to a certain degree people are allowed to criticize the government as much as they want. So if unlawful arrests are happening to the degree that Prop is saying that it's happening, people are going to know that unlawful arrests are happening. And unlawful arrests it's not possible for unlawful arrests to happen since due to the amount of media attention that Yukthiya is getting, but I'll talk about that in a second. So first argument about effectivity, right? About curbing the entire issue of drugs, because you can talk about how the issue in Sri Lanka the issue in Sri Lanka about drugs 2-3 years back, how exactly was such a big issue, with the pandemic, and lots people were getting kicked out of their jobs. They needed means to find some money, so they get into these drug circles. They start selling it, they start distributing it among school kids, where they lace food with certain amount of drugs. They transport it on school buses, and there was this whole entire issue in Sri Lanka, right? And you can talk about with an issue to this degree until the situation gets worse as it is in Central American and Latin American countries right now. You need to sort of make sure that this issue is curbed to the ground as much as you can, right? And you can talk about how after Yukthiya happened, there is a significant lack of access to these sort of drugs, especially among the younger community, simply because these are things, because there's an active deterrent against these sort of drugs in society right now. because even the smallest person, like who was just transporting the drugs, or the person who was just selling drugs just to make a quick buck, is now deterred from doing that because of this sort of attention that Yukthiya is getting, and simply because of the amount of arrests that they're making. So it means that at least to some degree there is an effectiveness at curbing this drug problem and minimizing the amount of spread of drugs within high popular areas in the country like Colombo, right? And you can talk about the media attention that Yukthiya gets and why exactly that's a good thing, right? Because like I said before, getting media attention is good, for the movement itself, because Yukthiya, people are going to know about what's happening, people are going to be supporting it, and people are more likely to report these sort of things to the police. So that's exactly a good thing, right? And second, you can talk about about unlawful arrests and how less likely that it is to happen, because like the moment you put out the stats and people actually are aware of like who was arrested and why they were arrested, that unlawful arrests are less likely to happen, right? Because like I said before, even though corruption is an issue in Sri Lanka, you can still criticize the government openly, and it does happen in status quo. So if people if the police does unlawfully arrest people, it will be called out, and they can be held accountable at least to a certain degree, right? And then you can talk about the sort of awareness that exists, right? Because among the younger generations, among society in general, like they're aware of the drug issue, and how to prevent how to keep away from this, and how exactly that's a good thing, right? And you can talk about the harms of drug use are much more worse than the assertions made on prop side as to like sort of issues that again, because you can take even on your worst case, even if you say that there are unlawful arrests happening, you can talk about that not all of them are unlawful arrests, A, and B, that the issues of drug use and the effects that it has on society is much more worse, that even in your worst case, that being the most important part of this bit of analysis, that even in your worst case, you're willing to make that concession because the harms of drug use leads to much more bigger systematic issues in a country. You can talk about how this sort of thing can be seen worldwide, where drug use and drug usage in general is leads to much more bigger social issues in the world, in society in general, right? And you can talk about, sure, the situation in Sri Lanka might not have been bad as it was in Mexico or in Latin American countries as it is, but like before you get into that point, how exactly that sort of solution is needed to make sure that Sri Lanka does not get into that point is sort of important, right? Okay. Second argument, you can talk about the sort of structural issues that exist. You can talk about systematic issues like poverty and all of these sort of things that comes about from drug use, and why exactly these sort of moderate solutions is not going to work for countries like Sri Lanka. Because you can talk about like things like warranted arrests, things like the proper due process where you ask for consent before searching from people and that sort of thing. People don't just randomly get strip searched in the middle of society. At worst, what happens on the Yukthiya, you can say that the worst that happens on the Yukthiya is that you're going on a bus and your bag gets searched. And you can talk about how moderate solutions aren't necessarily going to work in Sri Lanka because of the rampant corruptions that does exist in this thing. All right, and then you can talk about the economical states of people, right, and how exactly people get caught into these massive vicious cycles of poverty, in a vicious cycle of usage and addiction, which necessarily can lead to much more bigger issues in their lives, right? And you can talk about how exactly this necessarily gives the ability, it even deters people in the higher up positions, because they simply know that because the amount of attention this is sort of getting, that they are not safe either, right? Which means that the public gives more support to this sort of initiatives, which means these people in the higher up positions are more likely to be more vigilant when it comes to this sort of drug issues, and people who are involved in these drug rings are more likely to be deterred on your paradigm, as opposed to independent commissions that can be sort of useless in context like Sri Lanka. Also, you can talk about how you get more public support and why that's necessarily a good thing, because if you don't necessarily show any possible effectivity to the general public, unless you're the sort of person to go out there and look at these stats and sort of analyze these stats, see who was arrested, and just make a rational decision about it, which is not most people in the context of Sri Lanka, because most people don't necessarily have the time nor resources to sort of do this sort of research and make this active decision. So the moment that you show that you made this many arrests, you publicize it and sort of glorify it to the public, you're more likely to get more support, which means people are more likely to cooperate with the police, they're more likely to report sort of issues of drug abuse, which is necessarily a net benefit that you don't get on their end, because independent commissions are sort of devoid from public this thing, and the police is much more, it's much more easy to sort of get the support from the local communities with the police when they work with the police and whatnot, right? So the entire point of ops case is more than a principled approach. It's about to talk about how the issues of drug use, even in your worst case where you concede to some of the harms coming from prop, even in your worst case you can neglect those harms due to the net benefit that you get on your end. So you can talk about the issues of drug abuse, drug use, and why exactly curbing this right now is a big priority of the country. And you can then talk about how Yukthiya is the only way, since moderate solutions are less likely to be less likely to work in countries like Sri Lanka, and you can talk about the need for a solution and why exactly it's important. So the idea clashes in this debate after discussing the cases for both prop and op would be the principal clash with regards to government intervention and why exactly with the government intervention is necessary for these sort of problems, and then secondly you can talk about the effectivity on solving the issue on drugs. And I feel like this motion is fairly balanced, but I felt unfortunately at the debate that actually did happen that both sides sort of had an issue with sort of categorizing this debate properly in the context of Sri Lanka and the context of Yukthiya and debating it. So I hope that clarifies your doubts, and until next time, signing off, I am Dinika. Thank you.